What else I want to say about this? I want you to see how many children have parents who are incarcerated in the United States. Okay. So I have to bring these remarks to a close. I think that we're in desperate need of institutional reform with respect to how we manage the consequences of social dysfunction. Okay. We've got large numbers of undeveloped or underdeveloped people in our midst. That's because basic institutions of human socialization have failed. Schools in the inner cities don't work. Families and communities that may at one time have been more robust and nurturing no longer are so. There are large areas of no-go zones in many of our population centers. Okay? We have elected not to invest in these people and not to reform the institutions that their development depends upon. Okay? Some of them act out. There's no point in denying the reality of crime. There are people in our midst who are bent either on doing harm, relieving us of our property, or behaving in other ways that are socially disruptive and undesirable. Okay. Social control is a necessary element of governance. I am not, I'm not a pacifist here in the metaphorical sense. I'm not saying there should be no prisons. Okay. But institutionalized social control that is indirectly a mechanism of managing the consequences of not having developed people, of not having created circumstances in which they could reach their full human potential, that becomes social policy as a substitute for something that's affirmative. A punishing, punitive, oppressive, coercive social policy, and that becomes institutionalized. That should trouble us. Okay? It's going to have an intergenerational effect. Okay? What happens in San Quentin doesn't stay in San Quentin. The HIV virus that gets communicated from one person to another because of the unprotected anal sex that's happening every day in the jails of America, when after 2.5 years on the average those people go out, that virus goes with them. The hepatitis C virus, it's a virtual epidemic inside of American penal institutions, but it doesn't stay there. Okay? And neither do the attitudes and the modes of self-protection that are necessary in order to survive inside the prison stay in there. They come back into the community. And so I want you to see the just raw numbers. These are the numbers of Hispanic children who have parents incarcerated by year from 1980 to 2008. You can see it rises from roughly 1 million, that's 100,000 to about 400 and some, maybe 500,000. Those are Hispanic children. Those are white children. And those are black children. That's the number of children. That's the raw number of children, African Americans, who had a parent incarcerated. In 1980, that number was about 200,000. By the time we get to 2008, that number is 1.2 million. Okay? So while there may be, I don't know, 5 or 6 white Americans for every black American, as you can see, there are 2 or 3 black children with a parent in prison for every white child with a parent in prison. Having a parent in prison is something that's happening to great swaths of these African American youngsters in the communities which are disadvantaged. That has an adverse effect on those children. Okay? The wall between the prison and the community is porous. Okay? The prison is really, in a way, a part of the community. And the community is a part of the prison. Instead of creating institutions that are life-affirming, instead of expressing a social solidarity through which we communicate to the disadvantaged, there but for the grace of God go I, we are locking them up. We're corralling them. We're sweeping them off the street with mechanized, domestic, in some instances, paramilitary mobilizations. We're sweeping them off the streets, throwing them on the dustbin of human debris, and patting ourselves on the back for doing it, and we should be ashamed of ourselves for doing that. Now, this has to change, in my opinion, and you have to change it. Okay? If this is going to change, you have to change it. I heard a wonderful talk by a political scientist earlier today. Her name is Marie Gottschalk, and with any luck, she'll be our colleague here at Brown one day soon. She's at the University of Pennsylvania now. She was talking about the politics of, decarceration. How could it be made to happen? And one of her points, your natural reaction is, oh, this must violate some kind of human rights constraint. How can this be consistent with the Constitution? How come you can't get before the World Court or Supreme Court or somebody? I mean, isn't that racial stuff? Didn't we pass some laws back in the 60s about it somewhere? That's your natural reaction. Go to law school and check it out. Supreme Court has slammed the courthouse doors on the fingers of the poor, basically. You got a heck of a time. The Prison Litigation Reform Act of 1996. The Congress passes a statute that makes it, raises the bar like this in order to get into federal court to object to things like an AIDS isolation quarantine prison in Alabama called the Limestone Prison, where if you're an HIV positive person, they send you to a segregated prison. Okay. All of the crusaders about the inadequacy of healthcare services in prisons, and then you try to get into federal court, you try to bring under some kind of 8th Amendment or whatever it is, some kind of claim against the administrative practices denying health care to the prisoners. The Congress has made it very hard to get into court. All of the obvious lines of racial discrimination lawsuits that you might try to bring, the Supreme Court has cut it down because you got to have a smoking gun. You got to have a discriminating act. You can't have simply, oh, the police are doing drug policy, and the consequence of that through a complex set of mechanisms of choices of 5 and 6 different interlocking agencies is to result in a vastly disparate racial incidents. The Supreme Court doesn't buy that argument. You can't even show that a person who kills a black person is more likely to be executed in the state of Georgia by a factor of 4 or 5 than a person who kills a white person, which is actually the case, shown in the famous BALDUS, B-A-L-D-U-S study out of Northeastern University, where they got data on executions and the victim of the crime and whether or not the death penalty was applied. And they were able to show that if the person who was killed was black, you were much less likely to be executed than if the person who was killed was white. That was demonstrated statistically. They went into the Supreme Court trying to say, you ought to check out the death penalty. The way it's being applied in Georgia seems to be racially unequal. The Supreme Court, Justice Scalia in particular said, well, juries do what juries do. We don't, it's like the College of Cardinals, when the white smoke comes out, God has chosen. Nobody questions what the College of Cardinals do. Nobody says, Scalia in this opinion can question what the Supreme Court, in this Supreme Court opinion can question what a jury may have done. Of course there are biases in juries, says Justice Scalia. Of course there are biases in juries, but we believe in juries. We have to accept the outcome. I'm just making the point that the avenues toward change that go through the courts are relatively limited. A social movement is going to be necessary. I never thought that at the age of 61, I would be standing in front of an audience talking about a social movement. I thought that the 60s were a part of my youth, right? That was the 60s, right? Everybody was running around doing crazy stuff. There were demonstrations. Everybody was, the war and civil rights and everything like that. Without a social movement, without a mobilization, I'm not talking about abstract arguments and legal briefs. I'm talking about 10,000 people in front of the State House. Okay? I'm talking about, I'm sorry, if I say this, I might lose my job. Shutting down the traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay? What about the mothers, and what about the daughters, and what about the sons and the children? How many people are we going to punish? How many people are we going to punish? Okay. Without a grassroots movement that can bring people into the streets fired up about what's wrong here, it's never going to change. So the ball is in your court. Thank you.